Hello students, today we are focusing on Geoffrey Chaucer, who is considered the father of the English poetry and of the English language, and who lived in the late 14th century. His masterpiece, Canterbury Tales, is generally regarded as the very first example of properly English literary work. We could say, in a way, that Geoffrey Chaucer is our Italian Dante. In fact, just as Dante uses the dialect spoken in his city, Florence, to write literary works, Chaucer used the language spoken in his own city, London, to write poetry. Chaucer was actually very deeply influenced not only by Dante, but also by other two influential writers, Italian writers, Petrarch and Boccaccio, whom he probably met during his diplomatic missions in Italy. This lesson will focus on the influence these Italian writers exerted, more or less directly and more or less clearly, on the English writer whose works, after his first Italian trip in 1368, are so modeled on these Italian contemporaries that during the century he has been accused of imitation, and, as to Boccaccio, father of the Italian prose, even of plagiarism. As a matter of fact, Chaucer openly declares to be acquainted with the works of Dante and Petrarch, and in many works he refers to these writers or quotes directly from them. Conversely, he never mentions Boccaccio by name, nor does he quote directly from his works, especially his most celebrated Decameron, although their works and their approaches are very similar. In fact, we will see that Chaucer's masterpiece Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's masterpiece Decameron share many features both in the style used and in the themes developed, sometimes with nearly identical stories. According to some scholars, Chaucer and Boccaccio might have met in Milan in 1368 while attending the second wedding of Prince Lionel, son of the English king Edward III, with Violante, daughter of Galeazzo il Visconti, Prince of Milan. According to some scholars, on this occasion Chaucer is likely to have been introduced to Petrarch and Boccaccio. This view, however, has not been universally accepted, and many prestigious intellectuals have rejected it. But let's do things in an orderly fashion. First of all, who is Geoffrey Chaucer? Well, we could say that he is a crucial figure in developing the legitimacy of the dialect, the Middle English, when the dominant literary languages in England were French and Latin. The dominance of French following the Norman conquest in 1066 had impeded the growth of English as a literary language for hundreds of years, and it was not until the 13th century that the vernacular came once more to be used as a language of choice in all areas of society, including court and business. Nonetheless, most writers still wrote fluently in French and Latin as well as in their native tongue. To sum up, Chaucer proved that English could be written with elegance and power, and it is thanks to his works that its prestige grew as a medium for serious literature. Next, what are the main events of his life? Well, little is known about his personal life and even less about his education, although many existing records document his professional life. He was born in London, probably in 1343. His father was a wine merchant who had become tremendously wealthy when he inherited the property of relatives who had died in the Black Death in 1349. For this reason, unlike middle-class men who were required to comply with their parents' position, he was sent to be educated in a noble family, and in particular he was sent off as a page to the Countess of Ulster, who was the wife of Prince Lionel, the first wife of Prince Lionel, that, as we were saying before, was King Edward III's son. From that moment onwards, and for the rest of his life, he was connected with the royal court in London. Besides, for most of his life, he served in the 100 Years' War between England and France, both as a soldier and being fluent in French and Italian, as well as conversant in Latin and other tongues. He also worked as a diplomat. While he was fighting in the War of France, he was taken prisoner but released for a ransom, part of which was paid by the English king, the already mentioned Edward III. During the 1360s, he worked in the king's households and married Philippa, who was a lady of the Queen's court and sister to the mistress of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Besides, he was sent on several occasions on diplomatic missions to Italy. In particular, he went to Milan, Genoa, and he also visited cities like Padua, Pisa, and Florence. He already knew French literature well, but in Italy he got to know also the works of Italian writers, for example Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, as we said before. While writing contemporary tales, Chaucer continued to hold position at court. From 1389 to 1391 he was in charge of the buildings of the Palace of Westminster, and it was this position, not his writing, which gave him the right to be buried in Westminster Abbey after his death in 1400. In 1556, his remains were transferred to a more elaborate tomb, and since then other famous writers, for example Dickens, have been buried in the same area of the abbey, which has become known as the Poets' Corner. The influence of Chaucer's travels and contacts with other cultures is significant, and his work is normally divided into three periods: the French period, the Italian period, and the English period. In the first period, he translated into English the French poetic allegory about love, the Romance of the Rose, and wrote some allegories of his own, such as the Book of the Duchess. In the second period, he wrote Troilus and Cressida, the House of Fame, the Legend of Good Women, and so on. In the third period, he wrote the narrative poem Canterbury Tales, which he began in about 1387, and which was published by William Caxton, the first English printer, in the 1470s. So let us focus firstly on the influence of the Italian humanism on Chaucer's overall literature, and secondly, with a separate presentation, on his masterpiece Canterbury Tales. Let us start with Dante. Chaucer was very familiar with Dante's works, and in particular with Divina Commedia, and in fact he inserts English translations and adaptations from Divina Commedia in many of his works. Besides, he uses Dante's terza rima, for example, in Complaint of Pity and Complaint to His Lady. And last but not least, his work is also modeled on Divina Commedia in that it is a journey towards heaven. For example, the House of Fame is divided into three cantos and regards his dream vision on the sort of reconstruction of the story of Virgil's Aeneid. Then next, let's see the influence on the other two representatives of the Italian humanism, Petrarch and Boccaccio. Petrarch, we can say first of all that Chaucer introduced Petrarch's work into England, and we can see that, as we were saying before, in many works of Chaucer we have adaptations or even translations from Petrarch, for example, in Troilus and Cressida. Besides, the Pazienza Griseldis, which was Petrarch's adaptation, Latin adaptation of Boccaccio's last tale in Decameron, was also represented also a source for the Clerk's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. Last but not least, let's consider the influence of Boccaccio on Chaucer. And we have to say that probably Boccaccio is the one who exerted the greatest influence on Chaucer, although, as we were saying before, Chaucer never mentions Boccaccio by name. We can see, for example, that Boccaccio's Teseida and Filostrato influenced the Knight's Tale in Canterbury Tales, as well as the story of Menedon in Il Finocolo is a model for the Franklin's Tale, also in Canterbury Tales. But considering and focusing only on the works written in the so-called Italian period, we can say that Boccaccio's works on mythology actually influenced Chaucer's Legend of Good Women, as well as the Casibus Virorum Illustrium by Boccaccio may have inspired the Monk's Tale in Canterbury Tales. Last but not least, the plot of Filostrato can have exerted an influence on the House of Fama and Troilus and Cressida. So, Now, with a separate presentation, instead, we are focusing on the specific influence of these three writers, Italian writers, on the writing of Canterbury Tales. So for the time being, I thank you very much for your attention.